You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Boss Love Story channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. This content is the property of Mafia Boss Love Story. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The Romano estate glittered like something carved from ice and gold. Chandeliers throwing prisms of light across marble floors that had never known a scuff mark. Tonight, two empires were being stitched together with silk ribbon and champagne, though everyone in the room understood the truth beneath the celebration. This was a merger, not a marriage. Antonio Romano stood apart from the crowd, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand, watching the woman his brother was about to marry. Serafina De Luca moved through the room like she didn't belong to it, not because she lacked grace, but because she carried herself with something the Romano world rarely produced: warmth. She laughed at an old aunt's joke with her whole face, not the practiced half-smile most people wore in rooms like this. She touched a stranger's arm when she spoke to them, like connection mattered more than performance. Antonio had built his entire life on the principle that nothing mattered more than performance. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" His consigliere, Vincent, appeared at his elbow, following his gaze. Matteo got lucky. De Luca could have sent an old crone to seal this deal, and we'd have had to smile just the same. "He didn't get lucky," Antonio said, voice low and even, the tone that made grown men flinch. "He got assigned. There's a difference." Vincent said nothing further. He knew better than to press when Antonio's jaw tightened like that. Across the room, Matteo Romano, younger than Antonio by 6 years, softer in the face, still boyish despite the tailored suit, stood beside Serafina with the posture of a man enduring a business dinner. He said something to her. She nodded, polite, distant. Neither of them touched. Neither of them looked at the other, the way people who were about to spend their lives together should look. Antonio noticed. Antonio noticed everything. It was his job to notice everything. Since their father's death 8 years ago, Antonio had ruled the Romano family with a precision that bordered on surgical. He'd expanded their reach from the docks of Red Hook to the boardrooms of Manhattan, had buried 3 attempts on his life without so much as a public flinch, had made grown capos weep with a single sentence delivered in that flat, unhurried voice. New York's underworld did not fear many things. It feared Antonio Romano. And yet, watching Serafina De Luca laugh at something a waiter said, an actual unguarded laugh, quickly swallowed when she remembered where she was, Antonio felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for. Something he did not want a name for. "Antonio," Salvatore De Luca, Serafina's father, approached with the oiled smile of a man who'd spent 30 years pretending to be someone's friend right before betraying him. "Come, let me introduce you properly to my daughter." There was no avoiding it without offense, and offense, tonight of all nights, was not an option. Antonio set down his glass and let himself be led across the room, each step feeling heavier than the last, though he could not have explained why. "Serafina," Salvatore said, "this is Antonio, Matteo's brother, the head of the family." She turned, and up close her eyes were a shade of brown that seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. She extended her hand with the same politeness she might have shown a senator or a stranger on the street. No fear in it, which surprised him. Everyone feared him eventually. "Mr. Romano," she said, "I've heard a great deal about you." "All of it true, I'm sure," Antonio said, taking her hand. Her fingers were cool, small in his. He released them faster than manners required. "I hope my brother is treating you well." Something flickered across her face, there and gone like a shadow passing over water. "Matteo is very attentive," she said, choosing the word with obvious care. Attentive. Not loving, not devoted. Attentive. The way one is attentive to a business partner, a colleague, an obligation. Antonio filed that away the same way he filed away every piece of useful information, quietly, permanently. "If you'll excuse me," Serafina said, "I should find my mother." She offered a small, practiced smile and slipped away into the crowd, leaving behind the faint scent of jasmine and something Antonio could not identify. Something that made him want to follow her across the room and ask her what she actually thought of all this. The wedding, the family, the gilded cage she was about to be locked inside. He didn't follow her. He watched her go, the same way he watched everything, carefully, silently, cataloguing. "She's not what I expected," Vincent murmured, returning to his side. "What did you expect?" "Someone more breakable. DeLuca's only daughter, raised in that house. I thought she'd be a china doll." Vincent shook his head slowly. "She's got steel in her, that one, just wrapped in silk so you don't notice till it cuts you." Antonio didn't answer. He was still watching the space where she'd disappeared into the crowd, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt the uncomfortable sensation of wanting something he could not have. Something that belonged, by blood and by contract, to his own brother. He told himself it was nothing, a passing curiosity, a reaction to novelty in a world that offered him none. He told himself a great many things that night, standing alone at the edge of his father's old ballroom, watching his brother's fiancée disappear into a crowd of people who would kill her without hesitation if it served the family's interests. He did not yet know how wrong he would be proven, or how much it would cost him to admit it. Serafina DeLuca had grown up understanding exactly two things about her world: that love was a luxury reserved for other people, and that the DeLuca name was both a shield and a chain. She stood now on the balcony of her father's estate, 3 days after the engagement party, watching the lights of Manhattan blink against a bruised evening sky, and she allowed herself, for one private moment, to mourn the life she would never have. She had wanted to be a teacher once, had actually enrolled at Fordham under a different surname, sat in lecture halls beside students who had no idea their quiet, attentive classmate's father ordered men killed over territory disputes. For 2 years she had tasted what an ordinary life might feel like: coffee at diners, arguments about literature, the particular freedom of being nobody's daughter and nobody's future wife. Then her father had found out, and the ordinary life had ended the way most things ended in her world, quickly and without her consent. "You're going to catch a cold out here." She turned. Matteo Romano stood in the doorway to the balcony, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had been sent on an errand rather than a man visiting his fiancée. "I like the cold," Serafina said. "It's honest. It doesn't pretend to be something warmer than it is." Matteo's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. That's a very De Luca thing to say, poetic and vaguely threatening at the same time. I could say the same about you, Romanos. Charming, right up until the knife comes out. He laughed at that, a real laugh, and for a moment Serafina saw something almost likable in him. The boy underneath the obligation, the one who might have been a friend to her in another life, if their fathers hadn't decided their bodies were worth more as currency than their happiness was worth as an outcome. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And you'll answer honestly." "Depends on the question." "Do you want this? Any of it? The wedding? The alliance? Me?" Matteo was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the same skyline she'd been studying. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its performance, gone flat and tired in a way that made him seem older than his 26 years. "I want peace between our families," he said carefully. "I want my brother not to have to bury more men. I want—" He stopped himself, jaw working, and Serafina understood that he was editing something out of his answer, folding away a truth he wasn't ready to hand her yet. "That's not the same as wanting me," she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, it was simply the truth, spoken between two people who had learned long ago not to lie to each other about the things that didn't matter, even if they lied about everything else. "No," Matteo admitted. "It's not." "Good," Serafina said, "because I don't want you either. Not like that. At least we're honest about our dishonesty." He looked at her then with something like gratitude, like she'd handed him a gift he hadn't known he needed, permission to stop pretending, at least in private, at least with her. "You're the strangest fiancé I've ever had," he said. "How many have you had?" "You're the first, but I stand by the statement." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, because for once she wasn't performing for anyone. She was simply talking to a person who understood, without needing it explained, exactly how trapped she felt. "Your brother," she said after a pause, "he doesn't say much." Matteo's expression shifted, something careful entering his eyes. "Antonio doesn't need to say much. People listen anyway." "I noticed." She thought of the way Antonio Romano had looked at her at the engagement party, not with the leering interest she was used to from men in their world, and not with the polite disinterest she'd expected from a future brother-in-law, but with something else entirely. Something focused and quiet and unsettling, like he was reading a book whose ending he already suspected, but hadn't confirmed. "Careful with Antonio," Matteo said, and there was an odd note in his voice, something between warning and confession. "He's not what people think he is." "What do people think he is?" "A monster. Cold. Untouchable." Matteo shook his head slightly. "He's all of those things, when he needs to be. But he's also the only person who's kept this family alive since our father died. And he did it by caring more than anyone gives him credit for. He just doesn't let it show. It'd get him killed if he did." Serafina considered this, filing it away the way she filed away every useful piece of information, in a world where information was the only currency that mattered more than blood. "You care about him," she said. "Your brother." "He's the only person I trust completely," Matteo said simply, "which is why I need you to understand something, Serafina, and I need you to hear it clearly. Whatever this marriage is, an arrangement, a contract, a peace treaty with rings, it doesn't have to touch him. Antonio carries enough. Don't let this become one more thing he has to carry." She didn't understand then what Matteo meant by that, didn't understand the warning folded inside his words, the thing he could see coming that she could not yet imagine. She only nodded because it seemed like a reasonable thing to promise, a boundary easy enough to respect. She had no idea, standing on that balcony with the cold October wind pulling at her hair, that within a month she would break that promise without ever meaning to, that Antonio Romano would become the single most dangerous variable in her carefully controlled, carefully caged life, and that the danger would have nothing to do with bullets or blood feuds, and everything to do with the terrifying vulnerability of being truly seen. The attack came on a Tuesday, which Serafina would later think was almost insulting, as if her potential death had been scheduled between someone's dry cleaning and dinner reservation. She'd insisted on going to the small bookshop on Bleecker Street alone, over her father's objections, over the quiet disapproval of the two bodyguards who trailed her everywhere like expensive shadows. She wanted 20 minutes of her old life. 20 minutes of browsing shelves without an audience, without men in dark suits pretending to read magazines by the door. She got 12. The first sign was the black sedan that pulled up too fast outside the shop window. The second was the way the two men who emerged from it moved with the particular economy of people who did violence for a living. Serafina had grown up around men like that. She knew the walk before she consciously registered the danger. She was reaching for the emergency exit at the back of the shop when the front door shattered inward. What happened next occurred in fragments, the way trauma always does. Flashes of memory stitched together imperfectly. The gunman shouting for her to come with them quietly. No fuss. DeLuca wants no fuss. Her own hands shaking as she groped for a weapon that didn't exist among stacks of poetry and second-hand paperbacks. The bookshop owner screaming, diving behind the register, and then Antonio Romano appearing in the doorway like something conjured from the dark, moving with a speed and precision that made the two gunmen's confidence collapse in real time. She would replay it in her mind for weeks afterward, how he'd disarmed the first man before the man had even fully registered his presence, a brutal economy of motion that left the attacker choking on the floor within seconds. How the second man had gotten off a single wild shot before Antonio put him down permanently, the sound of it deafening in the small space, the smell of gunpowder and old books mixing into something Serafina would never be able to separate again. Then silence. Her own ragged breathing. Antonio crossing the room to her in 3 strides, his hands steady, so steady, checking her arms, her shoulders, her face for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, urgent, stripped of the careful control she'd seen at the engagement party. No, I don't think so." Her own voice came out smaller than she intended, shaking around the edges. "Look at me." He tilted her chin up with 2 fingers, his eyes scanning hers with an intensity that had nothing to do with checking for a concussion and everything to do with something Serafina didn't yet have language for. "You're in shock. That's normal. Breathe." "How did you know?" she managed. "How did you know to be here?" "I always know where you are," Antonio said, and then, as if hearing the confession in his own words, something closed over his expression, like a door shutting. He stepped back, putting distance between them, his voice returning to its usual flat control. "I have men watching you. Since the engagement, it's standard protocol for a bride marrying into this family." It wasn't true, not entirely, she would learn that much later, but in the moment she accepted it, too shaken to question the logic of a lie designed to protect her from a truth neither of them was ready to face. Police did not come. In their world, police never came. Instead, clean-up crews arrived within the hour, and the bookshop owner was paid an amount of money that erased both the damage and his memory of the event with equal efficiency. Serafina sat in the back office on a folding chair, a glass of water shaking slightly in her hands, while Antonio spoke in low, clipped Italian to Vincent by the door, arranging the details of a crime that would never officially exist. When he finally came to sit across from her, he looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "This was De Luca business," he said quietly. "Someone inside your father's organization wants this alliance to fail. They tried to take you, to send a message." "What message?" "That your father can't protect what's his. That includes you." Antonio's jaw tightened. "It won't happen again." "You can't promise that." "I can," he said, and there was something in the flatness of his voice, something absolute and immovable, that made her believe him despite every rational objection her mind offered. "I can, and I do." She studied his face, the sharp planes of it, the eyes that gave away nothing except, right now, in this narrow window of adrenaline and aftermath, everything. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter to you? I'm marrying your brother. I'm not your responsibility." Antonio was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "You're going to be family," he finally said. "I protect family." It was the second lie he told her that day, and like the first, she chose to believe it. Because the alternative, that he had appeared in that bookshop not out of obligation, but out of something far more dangerous, something he was only beginning to recognize in himself, was a truth neither of them could afford to name yet. Outside, the city moved on around them, indifferent to the two people sitting in the back of a ruined bookshop, already tangled in something neither of them had chosen, and neither of them could stop. Matteo noticed the change before Serafina did. The way his brother's schedule had quietly rearranged itself around her movements, the way Antonio, who had never once attended a De Luca family dinner in the 2 years since their fathers first discussed the alliance, now appeared at 3 in a row. He said nothing at first. He watched. "You're worried about the attack," Matteo said one evening, finding Antonio in his study at the penthouse, a wall of monitors before him displaying security feeds from the De Luca estate, the bookshop's street corner, 3 other locations Matteo didn't recognize. "I'm managing a threat," Antonio said, not looking away from the screens. "You're managing her." That got his brother's attention. Antonio turned, and for a moment something almost defensive flickered across his face before it smoothed back into its usual composure. "She's marrying into this family in 3 months. Someone tried to grab her off the street. What would you have me do, Matteo? Nothing? I'd have you tell me the truth about why you're the one doing it personally, instead of assigning it to Vincent or one of the capos." Matteo crossed his arms, studying his brother with the particular clarity of someone who had spent his whole life learning to read the smallest cracks in Antonio's control. "You don't do surveillance. You order it. You don't do bodyguard work. You command it. But here you are, at midnight, watching camera feeds of my fiancée's bedroom window." "It's not her bedroom window," Antonio said, too quickly. "It's the perimeter." Matteo said nothing, letting the silence do the work his words couldn't. Antonio set down the tablet in his hand with more force than necessary. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say the truth, for once in your miserable, controlled life," Matteo said, and there was no anger in it, only a strange, tired kindness. "I've known you 32 years, Antonia. I know what it looks like when you're protecting an asset. This isn't that." Antonio was silent for a long time, the blue light of the monitors carving hard shadows across his face. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual command. It was quieter, rawer, the voice of a man confessing something he'd rather have buried. "I don't know what this is," he admitted. "I've never—" He stopped, jaw tight. "It doesn't matter what it is. She's your fiancée. In 3 months she'll be your wife. Whatever this is, it ends there." "Does it?" Matteo asked, and something in his tone made Antonio look up sharply, because from where I'm standing, brother, you look like a man already lost. "I would never," Antonio said, low and fierce, "act on anything that would dishonor you or this family. You know that." "I know you'd rather die than dishonor the family," Matteo said. "That's exactly what worries me, because I don't think you're protecting her out of duty, Antonio. I think you're protecting her because the idea of something happening to her is unbearable to you. And that's not duty. That's something else entirely." Antonio didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them said more than either brother was willing to voice aloud, a silence thick with the particular grief of 2 men who loved each other enough to see the truth and gentle enough in that moment not to force it into the open before either was ready. "I need you to be careful," Matteo finally said, moving to the door. "Not for my sake, for hers, and for yours." "There's nothing to be careful of," Antonio said, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Matteo paused at the threshold, looking back at his brother, the most powerful, most feared man in New York's underworld, reduced in that moment to something achingly human, staring at a wall of screens showing a woman he had no right to want. "For what it's worth," Matteo said quietly, "I don't think this alliance was ever meant to be between her and me." He left before Antonio could ask what he meant, left his brother alone with the monitors and the silence and the slow, terrible understanding that something in his carefully ordered life had already slipped irretrievably out of his control. Antonio sat alone for a long time after Matteo's footsteps faded down the hall, staring at the small square of monitor showing Serafina's window, dark now, her light finally off, her day finally over. He thought about the way she'd looked at him in the bookshop, shaking and grateful, and utterly unaware of the storm she'd set loose in him, with nothing more than the sound of his name on her lips. He thought about duty and family and the particular hell of wanting the one thing in the world he could never allow himself to take. And then, because he was Antonio Romano, because control was the only religion he'd ever truly practiced, he closed the feed, turned off the monitors, and told himself, not for the first time and not for the last, that he would master this, that whatever this feeling was, he would bury it the way he buried everything inconvenient, quietly, completely, and without a trace. He was wrong. He would be wrong for a long time yet. The Onyx Room occupied the top floor of a building the Romano family owned outright, a place where New York's wealthiest and most dangerous came to be seen and to forget, in equal measure, the violence that funded their champagne. Serafina had never wanted to come. Her father insisted. Optics, he called it. The fiancé of a Romano needed to be seen enjoying Romano hospitality. And so she stood at the edge of the VIP section, in a dress the colour of dried blood, watching Matteo work the room with practised charm, and felt more alone than she had in months. She didn't see Antonio until he was beside her, materializing the way he always seemed to, without announcement, without warning. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, close enough that she felt the words more than heard them over the bass thrumming through the floor. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who knows what boredom looks like on a person who's spent her whole life performing contentment. He said it without judgment, an observation rather than an accusation, and something about the accuracy of it made her laugh, a short, surprised sound. That's oddly perceptive for a man who barely speaks. I speak plenty. I just don't waste words on people who don't deserve them. He glanced at her sideways, something almost like amusement ghosting across his mouth. Apparently you do. Before she could respond, a man approached from the crowd, tall, expensively dressed, with the particular oiliness of someone who thought charm was a substitute for substance. He introduced himself as Dominic Vitale, heir to a rival family Serafina vaguely recognized from her father's warnings. And within 30 seconds, his hand had found the small of her back, with a familiarity she hadn't invited. "Serafina de Luca," Dominic said, his eyes doing a slow, appraising sweep that made her skin crawl. "I've heard you're wasted on a Romano wedding." Shame to lock up something this beautiful before the rest of us got a chance to appreciate it. "I'm not property to be appreciated, Mr. Vitale," Serafina said coolly, stepping out of his reach. "Feisty. I like that." He reached for her hand, and before Serafina could pull away, Antonio's arm was between them, a wall of controlled fury, dressed in a tailored suit. "Take your hand back, Vitale," Antonio said. His voice pitched low, but there was something underneath it that made the surrounding conversation die instantly, heads turning despite the music. "Now." Dominic's smile faltered, recalculating the situation. "Didn't realize the future sister-in-law came with this much security, Romano. Something you want to tell me?" "I want to tell you that if your hand comes near her again, you'll lose it," Antonio said, each word measured and absolute. "That's not a threat. It's a fact you're welcome to test." The tension stretched taut, a held breath across the room, until Dominic laughed it off with false ease and melted back into the crowd, though not before shooting Serafina a look that promised this wasn't over. "You didn't need to do that," Serafina said quietly, once he was gone. "Yes, I did. Matteo's the one who should have. Matteo's across the room, flirting with a senator's daughter for the sake of a zoning permit," Antonio said, and something bitter edged his voice. "He's very good at his job." Serafina looked past Antonio's shoulder, and sure enough, there was Matteo, laughing easily with a woman in green, his attention entirely absorbed. She felt no jealousy watching him, only a strange, complicated relief that at least one of them was allowed to want something freely tonight. "Dance with me," Antonio said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise even himself. "What? You've been standing at the edge of this room for an hour, looking like you're serving a sentence. Dance with me. One song, then I'll leave you alone." She should have refused. Every instinct that had kept her alive in this world for 26 years told her to refuse. Instead, she found herself nodding, found her hand slipping into his as he led her toward the dance floor, found herself close enough to feel the heat radiating from him, close enough to smell cedar and something darker beneath it. They moved together in silence for a while, the music slow enough to allow it, and Serafina was intensely, uncomfortably aware of every point where their bodies touched. His hand at her waist, steady and warm, her palm against his shoulder, the careful, controlled distance he maintained, even as his eyes never left her face. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "You keep asking me that. Just ask. Why does it feel like you know me better after a month than my own fiancé does after 2 years?" Something shifted in Antonio's expression, guarded, almost pained. "Maybe I pay closer attention. Or maybe," she said, quieter now, the words feeling dangerous even as she spoke them, "there's a reason you pay attention that has nothing to do with protection protocols." Antonio's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist. For a moment, neither of them breathed. The music swelled around them, indifferent to the precipice they were both standing on. "Don't," he said finally, so low she almost missed it. "Don't ask me that question, Serafina. Not here. Not ever, if you can help it." "Why not?" "Because I might answer it," he said, and the song ended, and he stepped back, and the moment shattered like glass across the marble floor, leaving both of them standing in the wreckage of something neither was ready to name. 3 weeks passed in a strange, charged rhythm, Antonio's protective presence a constant, unacknowledged fixture in Serafina's life, neither of them speaking again of the moment on the dance floor, both of them pretending, with increasing difficulty, that the silence between them was comfortable rather than combustible. He drove her to her cake tasting because her usual security detail had a scheduling conflict. He appeared at the florist's when a delivery van blocked the loading zone and someone needed to negotiate, his voice dropping to a register that made grown men reroute their entire day. He showed up, always, at the exact moment she needed something, as though he had memorized the architecture of her life and positioned himself at every load-bearing joint. She started, despite every warning bell in her mind, to look forward to it. "You're spoiling me," she told him one afternoon, sitting in the back of his car after a dress fitting that had run long, watching Manhattan blur past the tinted windows. "I'm going to expect this kind of service from Matteo, and he's going to have no idea what I'm talking about." "Matteo has his own strengths," Antonio said, eyes on the road, jaw tight in a way that told her the observation had landed somewhere uncomfortable. "Does he?" It wasn't quite a question. "He's good with people, diplomatic. He'll run the legitimate side of the business better than I ever could." Antonio's hands flexed briefly on the wheel. "He'll make you a good husband, Serafina. Steady, kind. He won't—" He stopped himself. "He won't what?" "He won't put you in the position I put people in," Antonio said, quiet and controlled. "He won't ask you to live in the dark the way I live in it." "Is that what you think I want? Someone soft?" Serafina turned in her seat to look at him fully. "You've been watching me for months, Antonio. Tell me honestly, do I strike you as a woman who wants soft?" His jaw tightened at the sound of his name in her mouth, at the challenge underneath the question. What you want and what's good for you aren't always the same thing. That's a very convenient thing for you to decide on my behalf. I'm not deciding anything, he said, sharper than he intended. I'm stating a fact. You deserve a life without blood on the floor. Matteo can give you that, eventually, if this family ever stabilizes enough to let him step back from it. I can't give anyone that. I never will. The car slowed to a stop outside her father's estate, and for a moment neither of them moved to end the conversation, the engine idling, the privacy glass raised between them and the driver in front. You keep talking about what you can't give me, Serafina said softly, as though I've asked you for anything. You don't have to ask, Antonio said, and something in his voice cracked open, just slightly, just enough to let the truth bleed through the careful architecture of his control. I see it in the way you look at me, when you think I'm not paying attention. I see it because I do the same thing. I've spent 32 years learning to read people, Serafina, and you are the only person who has ever managed to make me forget every lesson I've learned. Her breath caught. The car felt suddenly too small, too warm, the space between them charged with something that had been building for months and could no longer be contained by silence. Antonio, don't, he said again, but this time it sounded less like a command and more like a plea, a man begging the universe to spare him a truth he could not survive and could not escape. Please, don't say it. If you say it, I don't know that I can keep pretending I haven't heard it. She looked at him, really looked, past the careful control, past the reputation that preceded him into every room, past the violence she knew lived in his hands and had, twice now, been turned in her defence, and saw a man as trapped as she was, caught in the same gilded machinery of family and obligation, forced to watch the thing he wanted most be handed to someone else by the accident of birth order. I won't say it, she promised, though her voice shook with the effort of the lie. Not yet. Not until we know what it would cost. It would cost everything, Antonio said. My brother, this family, possibly both our lives, depending on how De Luca reacts to a broken alliance and a scorned bride. I know. Then you understand why this has to stop, whatever this is. He gestured vaguely between them, a small, helpless motion, so unlike his usual composed authority that it made her chest ache. It has to stop, Serafina. For Matteo's sake. For everyone's sake. Okay, she said quietly, though neither of them believed it, not really. Not with the way his eyes lingered on her mouth for one unguarded second before he forced them away. Not with the way her own hand had drifted unconsciously toward the door handle, separating her from him and from the dangerous magnetic pull of everything she wasn't allowed to want. She got out of the car without looking back, because she knew if she looked back, she would see the same want reflected in his eyes that lived unbidden and unwelcome in her own chest, and she wasn't strong enough yet to survive that particular confirmation. Behind her, Antonio sat alone in the car for a long time after she'd gone, his hands gripping the wheel, his breath ragged in a way that had nothing to do with exertion, and thought, with a despair that frightened him more than any enemy ever had, that he was already lost. The second attack came without warning, 3 days after the moment in the car, and this time it wasn't aimed at Serafina directly. It was aimed at the wedding itself. A bomb, crude but effective, planted beneath the caterer's delivery van, scheduled to service the De Luca estate for the pre-wedding gala. It was discovered only because one of Antonio's men, doing a routine sweep he'd personally ordered doubled after the bookshop incident, noticed wiring that didn't belong beneath the vehicle's chassis. The bomb squad Antonio's people quietly employed, men who worked for cash and asked no questions, disarmed it within the hour. No one outside a tight circle of family and security ever learned how close the gala had come to becoming a massacre. "Someone is escalating," Vincent said grimly, standing in Antonio's study alongside Matteo and a still shaken Serafina, the four of them gathered around a table covered in surveillance photos and financial records. First an abduction attempt, now an explosive device. Someone wants this alliance dead, and they're willing to kill 100 wedding guests to make it happen. "Who benefits from the alliance failing?" Serafina asked, her voice tighter than usual, the adrenaline of near catastrophe still humming beneath her composed exterior. "Half of New York," Matteo said grimly. "A Romano de Luca alliance consolidates more territory and more legitimate business fronts than any partnership this city has seen in 20 years. Every rival family loses ground the moment those vows are said." "But it's not every rival family attacking us," Antonio said, studying the photographs spread across the table, images of the van, the wiring, a partial fingerprint lifted from the detonator. "This is precise, coordinated. Whoever's doing this has access to both families' schedules. They knew exactly which van, exactly which day." Serafina went very still. "You're saying it's someone inside?" "I'm saying it's someone with access to information only a handful of people should have," Antonio said carefully, watching her face. "My father would never—" "I'm not accusing your father," Antonio said, though the way Vincent's eyes flicked briefly to the floor suggested that possibility had already been discussed and dismissed for reasons of pure practicality rather than trust. "But someone close to him, or close to us." The room fell silent, each of them running through mental lists of who had access, who had motive, who among their trusted circles might harbour a grievance deep enough to risk mass murder to settle it. "I want additional security on Serafina," Antonio said finally, his voice brooking no argument. "Not the De Luca detail, my men. Around the clock, starting tonight." "That's excessive," Salvatore De Luca said, having entered midway through the conversation, his face pale, but his pride evidently still intact. "My daughter has adequate protection." "Your daughter almost had adequate protection blown into pieces, along with 100 guests," Antonio said flatly. "With respect, Salvatore, your protection failed twice. Mine hasn't failed once." The insult landed, sharp and precise, and Salvatore's jaw tightened with the particular fury of a proud man forced to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. "Fine," he said stiffly, "but I want reports, daily. I won't have my daughter disappearing into Romano custody without oversight." "Understood," Antonio said, though something in his eyes suggested he'd have agreed to Serafina's protection, regardless of what Salvatore permitted or forbade. Matteo, who had been quiet through most of the exchange, spoke up now. "I have a suggestion," he said, and something in his tone made Antonio look at him sharply. "Serafina should move into the penthouse. Officially, it's to consolidate security under one roof before the wedding. Unofficially—" He paused, glancing between his brother and his fiancée, with an expression Serafina couldn't quite read. "Unofficially, Antonio is better equipped to protect her than either of us, and we both know it. Matteo, Antonio started, a warning in his voice. I'm not suggesting anything improper, Matteo said, holding his brother's gaze steadily. I'm suggesting the practical solution, unless you have an objection to it. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of confession, Antonio's jaw working as he weighed the offer against every reason he'd catalogued for keeping distance. Serafina's heart hammering at the thought of what it would mean to live under the same roof as a man she'd been fighting, unsuccessfully, not to want. Fine, Antonio said finally, voice carefully neutral. She moves in tomorrow. Salvatore grumbled his reluctant agreement, already distracted by the logistics of announcing the arrangement to the wider family without inviting speculation. But Serafina caught the look Matteo gave his brother as the room began to empty. Something complicated. Something that looked almost like sacrifice, though she couldn't yet understand what he was sacrificing, or why. She would understand, eventually. But not yet. Not until the night everything finally broke open, months later, when Matteo's own carefully guarded truth would rewrite everything she thought she knew about the three of them and the tangled, dangerous shape of their love. For now, she only knew that she was moving into Antonio Romano's home, into the orbit of a man she had promised not to want, and that every rational instinct in her told her this was the single most dangerous decision of her entire life. She made it, anyway. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Central Park West, all glass and steel, and the particular cold luxury of a man who had never had time to make a house into a home. Serafina's belongings arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked by silent staff into a guest suite 2 doors down from Antonio's own room. Close enough, she thought, that she'd hear him moving at night, far enough that propriety could still, technically, be claimed. You'll have full access to the East Wing, Antonio told her that first evening, giving her the kind of clipped, efficient tour he might have given a business associate. Kitchen, library, the terrace. My study and the security floor are off-limits for obvious reasons. Naturally, Serafina said, trailing a finger along the spine of a book on the library shelf. An actual, well-worn copy of Dante surprising her. You read this? I read everything, Antonio said. There isn't much else to do at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep. Can't sleep often? More often than I'd like to admit. He watched her handle the book with something careful in his expression. You can borrow it if you want. I don't need to borrow it. I have my own copy. She smiled slightly. I just didn't expect you to have read it. Most men in your position collect books for the shelves, not the pages. I'm not most men in my position, Antonio said, and there was no arrogance in it, only a flat statement of fact that made her look at him again, reassessing, the way she seemed to do every few days as new pieces of him revealed themselves. Dinner that first night was a strange, careful affair. The 2 of them at a long table, clearly built for entertaining dozens rather than the intimate quiet of 2 people navigating an impossible situation. They talked about nothing consequential. Books, the city, a documentary about deep-sea creatures Antonio had apparently watched obsessively the previous winter, a fact so unexpectedly human that Serafina found herself laughing harder than the anecdote warranted. "What?" Antonio asked, almost defensive. "Nothing. It's just I keep forgetting you're a person and not just a legend people whisper about." "I'd prefer you kept forgetting, honestly. The legend is useful. Fear keeps people alive longer than kindness does, in my line of work." "Does it keep you alive, though? Or does it just keep you isolated?" The question landed harder than she'd intended, and she watched something flicker across his face. Surprise first, then something rawer underneath it. "Both, probably," he admitted quietly. "I stopped distinguishing between the two a long time ago." "That sounds lonely." "It is." He said it simply, without self-pity. A fact stated the way he stated everything, and something about the honesty of it undid her more than any grand declaration could have. After dinner, she found herself on the terrace, the city spread out below like a field of stars fallen to earth. And she wasn't surprised when Antonio joined her a few minutes later, 2 glasses of wine in his hands. "Peace offering," he said, handing her one, "for interrogating you about your reading habits at dinner." "I liked interrogating you." She accepted the glass, their fingers brushing briefly, both of them pretending not to notice the way the contact lingered a half-second too long. "You should let people in more, Antonio. It's not a weakness." "In my world, it is." He leaned against the railing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him in the cool evening air. "Every person I've ever let in has either used it against me or ended up dead because of their proximity to me. Sometimes both." "I'm not afraid of either outcome," Serafina said quietly. "You should be." "Why? Because you'll hurt me? Or because loving you will get me killed?" The word hung in the air between them, love, spoken almost carelessly, almost as a hypothetical, but neither of them could pretend it hadn't landed with the full weight of truth behind it. Antonio's hand tightened around his glass. "Both," he said finally, voice rough. "I would never hurt you, Serafina. Not with my hands, not intentionally. But loving me, being loved by me, it's a death sentence for anyone who isn't already prepared to live in the dark for the rest of their life. I've watched it happen. I won't watch it happen to you. You don't get to decide that for me. I get to decide what I allow myself to want," Antonio said, turning to face her fully now, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. "And I have decided every single day for the past 3 months that I will not want you. I fail at that decision constantly, but I keep making it because the alternative destroys everyone I love, my brother, this family, possibly you." "And if I told you," Serafina said, her voice barely above a whisper, the wine forgotten in her hand, "that I've made the same decision every single day and failed just as often?" Antonio's eyes searched hers, something desperate and starved moving behind the careful control, and for a long, suspended moment, she thought he might close the distance between them entirely, might finally let the thing they'd both been drowning for months come up for air. Instead, he stepped back, setting his glass down with deliberate care, putting the width of the terrace between them, like a man retreating from a ledge. "Then we're both very good at failing," he said, voice rough, "and very bad at surviving it. Good night, Serafina." He left her alone on the terrace, with 2 half-finished glasses of wine, and a silence that screamed louder than any confession could have, and she stood there, a long time after he'd gone, watching the city lights blur through the sudden, unwelcome sting of tears she refused to let fall. Living under the same roof did not, as Antonio had hoped, dull the ache of wanting her. If anything, proximity sharpened it into something almost unbearable. The sound of her laughter drifting from the kitchen in the mornings, the sight of her curled in the library with one of his books, her hair still damp from a shower, the particular way she said his name that had started, against every ounce of his resistance, to feel like the only word in the English language that mattered. He was managing it, barely. Until the night Dominic Vitali showed up uninvited to a charity gala the Romano family sponsored, and Antonio watched the man corner Serafina by the bar with the same predatory ease he'd shown at the Onyx Room months earlier. "I heard you moved in with the older brother," Dominic said, loud enough that Antonio, watching from across the room, caught every word. "Getting a preview of the goods before the wedding, DeLuca? Bold strategy." "That's none of your business," Serafina said coldly, trying to step past him. Dominic's hand closed around her wrist, not violent but proprietary, the grip of a man who believed he was entitled to touch what he wanted, regardless of consent. "Come on, sweetheart, everyone's talking about it. Antonio Romano, the Ice King himself, playing house with his baby brother's fiancée. Makes you wonder what kind of arrangement you three have got going." He didn't finish the sentence. Antonio crossed the room in a blur of controlled violence, closing the distance in seconds, and had Dominic's wrist bent backward at an angle that drew a sharp, undignified yelp from the man before most of the room had even registered movement. "You will apologize to Ms. DeLuca," Antonio said, voice low and terrible. "And then you will leave this event. And if I ever hear my brother's fiancée's name in your mouth again, in any context, I will remove the tongue that speaks it. Do you understand me?" "Antonio," Serafina started, alarmed by the crowd already gathering, by the barely controlled violence radiating off him in waves. "Do you understand me?" Antonio repeated, ignoring her, his grip tightening until Dominic's face went pale with genuine fear. "I understand," Dominic gasped. "Christ, let go, I understand." Antonio released him with a shove that sent the man stumbling backward into a waiter, glasses shattering on the marble floor, and the room fell into the particular hush that followed any public display of Romano temper, a hush built from equal parts fear and fascination. Dominic fled the gala within minutes, humiliation trailing behind him like smoke. Antonio turned to Serafina, still breathing hard, his composure fractured in a way she'd rarely witnessed. "Are you hurt?" "No, Antonio, that was—" She glanced around at the watching crowd, the whispers already spreading like wildfire. "That was excessive. People are going to talk." "Let them talk." His hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly, adrenaline and fury still coursing through him. "I don't care what they say about me. I care that he put his hands on you." "You can't keep doing this," she said quietly, pulling him gently toward a quieter corner of the room, away from prying eyes. "Every time someone looks at me wrong, you react like I'm yours to defend. People are starting to notice, Antonio. Matteo is going to notice." "Matteo already knows," Antonio said, and something in the admission seemed to cost him. "He's known for months." Serafina's breath caught. "And he said nothing?" "He said everything in his own way. He warned me, back at the very beginning, to be careful with you. I don't think either of us understood then exactly what he was warning against. Antonio's jaw tightened, his eyes finally meeting hers with a rawness he usually kept locked away. I can't watch another man touch you, Serafina. I've tried to explain it to myself as protection, as duty, as anything other than what it actually is. But watching Vitale put his hands on you tonight, I wanted to kill him. Not hurt him, kill him. And it wasn't about family honor or alliance politics. It was because the thought of anyone touching you who isn't me makes something in my chest go dark in a way I don't recognize and can't control. The confession hung in the air between them, more dangerous than any bomb, more explosive than any turf war. Serafina's heart hammered against her ribs, the noise of the gala fading to background static around them. "Antonio," she whispered, "you can't say things like that to me." "I know," he said, voice breaking slightly on the words. "I know I can't. I'm saying it anyway because I'm tired, Serafina. I'm tired of pretending I don't feel what I feel every time you walk into a room. I'm tired of watching my brother fail to see what's right in front of him while I drown in it every single day." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Antonio said, stepping closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her temple, close enough that every rational thought in her mind dissolved into pure, terrified want. "That I am in love with you, Serafina De Luca. And I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending otherwise, for Matteo's sake or my own." The words landed like a struck match against dry kindling, and for one suspended, breathless moment, Serafina thought the entire careful architecture of their restraint might finally collapse into each other, right there in the corner of a crowded ballroom. Consequences be damned. Then a voice called Antonio's name from across the room, Vincent, urgent, apologetic, and the moment shattered, leaving them both standing in the wreckage of a confession that could not be unsaid, staring at each other across a distance that suddenly felt both impossibly small and utterly insurmountable. Antonio did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after the gala's chaos had settled, long after Vincent's urgent business, a supplier dispute, mundane and irrelevant compared to what he'd just confessed, had been handled with an efficiency that felt hollow, mechanical, a man going through motions while his mind replayed 4 words on an endless loop. "I am in love with you." He had spent 32 years building himself into a man who did not make mistakes, who calculated every move 3 steps ahead, who never let emotion compromise strategy. And in the space of one furious, jealous moment, he had unmade all of it with a single sentence spoken to the one woman in New York he had no right to want. A knock at his study door pulled him from the spiral. He expected Vincent. He found Serafina instead, still in her gala dress, hair loosened from its earlier style, standing in his doorway, with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though he made no move to send her away. "Probably not." She stepped inside anyway, closing the door softly behind her. "But I couldn't sleep either, and I think we need to talk about what you said." "I shouldn't have said it." "But you did. And I need you to know." She paused, gathering herself, and Antonio watched her fight for the same courage it had cost him to speak the truth hours earlier. "I need you to know that I feel it too. I felt it since the bookshop, maybe before, if I'm honest with myself. I've been trying to bury it because it's impossible, because it would destroy everything. But I can't. I can't keep pretending anymore, Antonio. Not after tonight." He crossed the room to her before conscious thought caught up with instinct, close enough now that neither of them could hide behind distance any longer. "This can't happen," he said, though his hand had already found her cheek, thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted every word he spoke. "Serafina, if we do this, if we let this happen, it destroys my brother. It destroys the alliance. Men could die. You understand that, don't you? This isn't a fairy tale where love conquers every obstacle. This is our world, where love gets people killed." "I know," she whispered, leaning into his touch despite her own warning. "I know all of that, and I still can't stop wanting you. I've tried, Antonio. God, I've tried so hard to be the woman this family needs me to be, to marry Matteo and build a life around obligation instead of feeling. But every time you walk into a room, every part of that resolve just disappears." "We can't," Antonio said again, but his forehead had dropped to rest against hers, their breath mingling in the charged silence of the study, every line of his body straining against a restraint that was rapidly failing. "We can't do this to him." "I know," Serafina agreed, her hand coming up to rest against his chest over the frantic beat of his heart. "So we won't. We'll go back to pretending tomorrow. We'll go back to being careful. But tonight," her voice broke slightly, "tonight, can we just admit it, at least? Just this once? Can we have this much, even if we can never have more?" Antonio closed his eyes, every principle he'd built his life around screaming at him to step back, to send her to her room, to lock this feeling in the same vault where he buried every other dangerous truth. Instead, he let himself, for one reckless moment, simply exist in the space of wanting her, without guilt. "Just this once," he agreed, voice rough with the effort of restraint, even as he allowed himself the small mercy of pressing his lips to her forehead. Not a kiss, not quite, but close enough to feel like surrender. "Tomorrow, we go back to being careful. Tomorrow, I am your future brother-in-law, and nothing more. But tonight, Serafina, I need you to know that loving you is the truest thing I have ever felt, and the greatest tragedy of my life is that I cannot act on it." She pressed closer, her cheek against his chest, listening to the racing rhythm of his heart, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content to simply hold the fragile, forbidden truth between them like something precious and doomed. "What happens now?" she finally whispered. "Now," Antonio said, forcing himself to step back, to rebuild the distance that duty demanded. "You marry my brother in 2 months, and I learn to live with watching it happen, and we both pretend this conversation never occurred, because the alternative is a war neither family will survive." "And if I can't marry him?" Serafina asked, the question raw and dangerous in the quiet room. "If every day that passes makes it harder to imagine standing at that altar and promising forever to a man I don't love, while the man I do love watches from the front row?" Antonio had no answer for that. He only knew, watching her retreat toward the door, her silhouette framed by the hallway light, that whatever fragile control he'd maintained for months had cracked irreparably that night, and that somewhere in the weeks ahead that crack would widen into something neither of them would be able to contain. He didn't yet know that Matteo, 3 floors below in his own apartment across town, was staring at his own phone at that exact moment, reading a text message from someone Serafina had never heard of, a name that would, within weeks, unravel the entire fragile arrangement holding their 3 lives in careful, agonizing balance. Matteo Romano had fallen in love 4 years before he ever met Serafina De Luca with a man named Ezra Castellano, a jazz musician from Brooklyn with no mafia ties, no family obligations, no place whatsoever in the carefully ordered world Matteo had been born into. It was a secret he had guarded more carefully than any business deal, more carefully than any territorial dispute, because in a world like theirs, Catholic, old world, obsessed with legacy and bloodline, a Romano son loving another man was not merely inconvenient. It was, in the eyes of men like Salvatore De Luca, a weakness that invited attack from every rival family circling for an opening. So Matteo had done what was expected of him. He had accepted the engagement to Serafina with the same resigned efficiency he brought to every family obligation, had told himself that duty and love could occupy separate rooms in a man's heart, without one ever touching the other, had convinced himself, almost successfully, that he could build a life of comfortable companionship with Serafina, while keeping Ezra folded carefully into the margins of his existence. A Tuesday night, a stolen weekend, always careful, always hidden. It had worked, for a while. Until he'd watched his brother fall in love with his fiancée in real time, month by month, and felt something in his own careful compartmentalization begin to buckle under the weight of everyone's performed happiness. "You look troubled," Ezra said, the night after the gala, the two of them tangled together in the dim light of Ezra's Brooklyn apartment, the only place in the city where Matteo ever fully exhaled. "More than usual." "My brother's in love with my fiancée," Matteo said flatly, staring at the ceiling, "and she's in love with him. I've watched it happen for months and said nothing, because saying something means admitting that this whole arrangement was doomed from the start." Ezra propped himself up on one elbow, studying Matteo's face with the particular tenderness that had first drawn Matteo to him 4 years ago, a gentleness utterly foreign to the world Matteo had grown up in. "Do you love her?" "No," Matteo admitted. "I care about her, I respect her, but I've never loved her. Not the way Antonio does, not the way—" He stopped himself, but Ezra finished the thought with a small, sad smile. "Not the way you love me." "Not the way I love you," Matteo confirmed quietly. "Then why haven't you ended it?" Matteo was silent for a long moment, turning the question over, feeling the full weight of everything that answer implied. "Because if I end the engagement, I have to explain why. And explaining why means telling my father, my brother, an entire family built on tradition and bloodline, that their heir apparent is in love with a man. It means putting a target on your back, Ezra, and on mine, because there are people in this world who would use that information as a weapon before they'd ever accept it as truth. So you'd rather marry a woman you don't love and force your brother to watch the woman he does love walk down the aisle toward you." Ezra's voice was gentle but unflinching. "Matteo, that's not protecting anyone. That's just delaying everyone's pain, including your own." "I know," Matteo whispered, and the admission felt like the first honest thing he'd said aloud in months. "I know, Ezra. I've known for weeks. I just don't know how to undo something this size without destroying everything it's built to protect." "Maybe," Ezra said carefully, The thing you're protecting was never actually stable to begin with. Maybe an alliance built on two people who love other, entirely different people was always going to collapse eventually. Better it collapses now, on your terms, than after the wedding, when the damage is permanent. Matteo lay awake long after Ezra had fallen asleep beside him, staring at the ceiling of an apartment his family didn't know existed, turning over 4 years of careful hiding, of duty performed at the cost of his own happiness, of watching his brother, the strongest, most controlled man he'd ever known, slowly come undone over a woman neither of them was supposed to want. He thought about Serafina, about the strange, easy friendship they'd built, despite the absence of romantic love, about the way she'd looked at Antonio across every room they'd shared for the past 6 months, a longing so plain that Matteo sometimes wondered how their fathers hadn't noticed it themselves. He thought about his own cowardice, dressed up as sacrifice, and felt, for the first time in years, a flicker of genuine anger at himself for letting it continue this long. By the time dawn broke over Brooklyn, Matteo had made a decision. He didn't yet know how or when he would act on it, only that the wedding date, now 6 weeks away, had become a deadline he could no longer avoid. He kissed Ezra's shoulder gently before slipping out of bed, dressing in the pale morning light, already composing in his mind the conversation he would need to have with his brother, with his fiancée, with a family built on the assumption that love was a currency to be spent strategically rather than felt honestly. He had spent 4 years being strategic with his own heart. It was time, finally, to be honest with everyone else's. The investigation into the bombing attempt finally yielded a name 3 weeks before the wedding, and it was a name that shook the fragile peace of both families to its foundation. Carlo De Luca, Serafina's own cousin, second in line to inherit a portion of her father's territory should the alliance with the Romanos fail to materialize. He's been feeding information to a coalition of smaller families, Vincent reported, spreading documents across Antonio's desk. Financial transfers, encrypted messages decrypted through channels Antonio preferred not to examine too closely. Photographs of Carlo meeting with men whose faces belonged to organizations hostile to both De Luca and Romano interests. If the wedding happens, his inheritance shrinks to almost nothing. Salvatore's been grooming Matteo as an eventual successor for the De Luca holdings, consolidating everything under a Romano De Luca banner. Carlo loses his entire future the moment those vows are said. Antonio studied the photographs with the flat, dangerous calm that preceded his most decisive actions. He tried to have his own cousin kidnapped. Then he tried to kill 100 wedding guests to stop a marriage that threatens his inheritance. "It gets worse," Vincent said grimly. "We intercepted a message this morning. He's planning something for the wedding itself, something bigger than the bomb. He's recruited outside muscle, professionals, not family soldiers. If this goes forward as planned, he's not just trying to stop the wedding anymore. He's trying to eliminate both families' leadership in one strike." Antonio's hands went very still on the desk. Both families' leadership. That means Salvatore, Matteo, me. "And Serafina," Vincent confirmed quietly. "He can't risk leaving witnesses who could identify his involvement, and he certainly can't risk leaving his cousin alive to inherit anything once her father and future husband are gone." The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Antonio stood, moving to the window overlooking the city, his mind already racing through contingencies, security protocols, ways to dismantle Carlo's plan before it could fully materialize. "We move up the timeline," Antonio said finally. "The wedding stays scheduled publicly, but we change the actual security architecture completely. New venue details known only to essential personnel. A decoy schedule leaked to draw out Carlo's people before the real event. And I want him alive when we find him. I want to know exactly who else is involved before anyone touches him." "And Serafina?" Vincent asked carefully. "Does she know?" Antonio's jaw tightened. "Not yet. I need to tell her myself." He found her in the library that evening, curled into the window seat with a book she wasn't really reading, the late autumn light casting long shadows across the room. She looked up as he entered, and something in his expression must have telegraphed the gravity of what he carried, because she set the book aside immediately, her whole body going tense with anticipation. "What happened?" "We found who's behind the attacks," Antonio said, crossing the room to sit across from her, close enough to reach for her hands if she needed the steadying contact, far enough to maintain the careful distance they'd both been trying, unsuccessfully, to hold since the night in his study. "It's your cousin, Serafina, Carlo." She went pale, the colour draining from her face as the implications settled. "Carlo? He's family. He came to my christening. He taught me to ride a bike." "He also stands to lose his entire inheritance the moment you marry into this family," Antonio said gently. "People do terrible things when their future collapses, even to people they love, maybe especially to people they love, because proximity makes betrayal easier." "What does he want now?" Antonio hesitated, weighing how much to tell her, before deciding she deserved the full truth, deserved to understand exactly how dangerous her world had become. "He's planning something for the wedding, something designed to eliminate both families' leadership at once. You, your father, Matteo, me, all of us, in a single coordinated strike." Serafina's breath caught, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of it settled over her. "He wants to kill all of us. His own family." "We won't let that happen," Antonio said, and there was something absolute in his voice, a promise carved from steel. "I've already begun restructuring the wedding security. He won't get anywhere near you, Serafina. I swear it." "How can you promise that? How can you promise anything when the person threatening my life is someone I've trusted since I was a child?" Her voice cracked, the accumulated weight of months of danger finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "I'm so tired, Antonio. I'm tired of living in a world where every person who claims to love me is secretly calculating how useful my death might be to their ambitions." "Not everyone," Antonio said quietly, reaching across the space between them to take her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her knuckles. "Not me. Never me." "I know," she whispered, and the two words carried the full weight of everything neither of them had allowed themselves to fully claim since that night in his study. "That's the only thing keeping me from falling apart entirely." They sat together in the fading light, hands intertwined, the threat of Carlo's conspiracy hanging over them like a blade suspended by a fraying thread. And neither of them spoke of the deeper danger they both knew was coming. Not from Carlo, not from rival families, but from the impossible, inevitable collision course their own hearts had set them on. one that no amount of careful restraint would be able to prevent forever. Despite every precaution, despite Antonio's restructured security and doubled surveillance, and the quiet, brutal efficiency with which he'd begun dismantling Carlo's network piece by piece, the attack came from a direction none of them anticipated, not at the wedding, but 2 weeks before it, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, when Serafina, against Antonio's explicit instructions, slipped away from her security detail for a single hour to visit her mother's grave alone. She never made it back to the car. Antonio received the alert at 3:47 p.m., her tracking signal going dark, her bodyguard found unconscious near the cemetery gates, no sign of Serafina anywhere in the surrounding blocks. The 40 minutes that followed would remain, for the rest of his life, the worst of his existence. Worse than his father's assassination, worse than every war he'd fought to hold his empire together. Worse than any nightmare his carefully controlled mind had ever conjured. "We have a location," Vincent reported, bursting into the war room Antonio had assembled within minutes of the alert, 20 of his most trusted men already armed and mobilizing. "Warehouse in Red Hook, one of Carlo's known properties. Thermal imaging shows at least 6 hostiles inside, plus what looks like a hostage in the eastern section." "Get me eyes on that building in 10 minutes, Antonio said, his voice a flat, terrible calm that Vincent recognized as the sound of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. "I want a full assault plan in 15, and someone find Matteo. He needs to know." Matteo arrived within minutes, his usual easy composure entirely gone, replaced by a fury Antonio had rarely seen in his younger brother. "I'm coming with you." "You're not trained for this, Matteo." "She's my fiancée," Matteo snapped, "regardless of whatever's happening between the two of you, and I am coming with you to get her back, Antonio, and you are not going to stop me." Antonio didn't argue further. There wasn't time, and some part of him understood that Matteo needed this, needed to act, to fight for her in some capacity, even knowing what he now suspected about his brother's feelings for the woman they were both racing to save. The assault on the warehouse, when it came, was swift and brutal. Antonio's men moving with the precision of a unit that had trained for exactly this scenario, clearing rooms with a speed that left little opportunity for Carlo's hired muscle to organize any real defense. Antonio himself led the breach into the eastern section, where Serafina had been reported held, his heart hammering with a fear more absolute than anything he'd felt in 3 decades of violence. He found her bound to a chair in a stripped concrete room, a bruise darkening along her cheekbone, her eyes wide with terror that dissolved into desperate relief the moment she saw him in the doorway. "Antonio!" Her voice broke on his name. He crossed the room in seconds, cutting her bindings with hands that shook for the first time in longer than he could remember, pulling her into his arms with a fierceness that spoke of every restrained emotion of the past 6 months, finally breaking free. "I've got you. You're safe. I've got you." "Carlo was here," she gasped against his chest, her whole body trembling. He said if the wedding happened, he'd make sure none of us survived it. He said he'd rather burn the whole alliance down than watch it succeed without him at the top of it." "He'll never touch you again," Antonio said, voice rough with barely contained rage, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other pressed flat against her back, as if he could shield her from every future danger through proximity alone. "I promise you that, Serafina. I promise you on everything I have." Matteo appeared in the doorway then, taking in the scene, his brother holding his fiancée with a desperation that transcended every careful boundary they'd maintained for months. And something in his expression shifted, hardened into a decision Serafina wouldn't fully understand until weeks later. "Is she hurt?" Matteo asked, his voice steady despite the visible relief flooding his features. "Bruised, shaken, nothing that won't heal," Antonio said, reluctantly loosening his hold enough to let Serafina stand, though his hand remained at the small of her back, steadying, possessive, in a way neither brother acknowledged aloud. "Carlo?" Matteo asked. "Alive," Antonio said grimly. "For now. I want answers before anyone decides his fate." They extracted Carlo from a separate room of the warehouse, bound and battered from the brief resistance he'd offered. His earlier bravado collapsed into pale, desperate pleading the moment he understood the full extent of what he now faced. Antonio interrogated him personally in a voice so devoid of mercy that even Vincent, hardened by decades of violence, found himself unable to fully meet his boss's eyes. By the time the sun set over Red Hook, they had names. Every family involved in Carlo's coalition, every soldier hired for the wedding day assault, every detail necessary to dismantle the conspiracy before it could claim a single additional life. Carlo De Luca did not survive the week. The details of his fate were never discussed openly within either family, though everyone understood, without needing confirmation, exactly what had happened to a man who had tried to murder his own blood for the sake of inheritance. That night, back at the penthouse, Serafina showered away the terror of the day and found Antonio waiting in the hallway outside her room, his composure finally cracking entirely, exhaustion and fear and relief warring openly across his face for the first time since she'd known him. "I almost lost you today," he said, voice raw. "I have buried men I loved, Serafina. I have survived wars that should have killed me. Nothing has ever terrified me the way those 40 minutes terrified me, not knowing if you were alive." "I'm here," she whispered, closing the distance between them, her hand coming up to rest against his jaw, feeling the tension there, the barely restrained grief of a man who had almost lost everything. "I'm here, Antonio." "I can't keep pretending anymore," he said, the words tumbling out of him now, the dam finally breaking after months of careful restraint. "I can't watch you marry my brother and pretend I don't want to burn this entire arrangement to the ground just to keep you safe in my arms, instead of watching you walk away every single night to a room that isn't mine." "Then don't pretend," Serafina said softly. "Not anymore. I can't do this anymore either, Antonio. Today taught me that. Life is too short, too dangerous, to keep denying the one true thing we've both been running from for months." They stood in the quiet hallway, foreheads pressed together, the boundary between them worn down to almost nothing by the day's terror and its aftermath, both of them teetering on the edge of a confession that would finally, irrevocably, change everything. And it was in that fragile, suspended moment that Matteo's voice came from the end of the hallway, quiet and unsurprised, carrying the weight of a decision he had already made. "I think," Matteo said, "it's time the three of us had an honest conversation." They sat together in the penthouse's living room an hour later, the three of them arranged in a careful triangle that felt, to Serafina, like the culmination of 6 months of unspoken tension finally forced into the light. Antonio sat rigid in an armchair, his expression carefully neutral in a way that fooled no one in the room. Serafina perched on the edge of the sofa, still faintly bruised, her hands twisted together in her lap. Matteo stood by the window, looking out at the city with the particular calm of a man who had made peace with what he was about to say. "I need to tell you both something," Matteo began, turning to face them, "and I need you to let me finish before either of you says anything, because if I stop, I don't know that I'll find the courage to start again." Antonio's jaw tightened, but he nodded once, silent permission. "I've been in love with someone else for 4 years," Matteo said, and the words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward into a silence so complete Serafina could hear her own heartbeat. "His name is Ezra. He's a musician. He has nothing to do with this world, and he never will, because I've spent 4 years hiding him from all of it, from our father's memory, from the family, from everyone, because I was terrified of what it would mean, all a Romano heir, to love a man instead of a woman." Serafina's breath caught, 100 small observations suddenly clicking into place. Matteo's distance from her, his careful, deliberate lack of romantic interest, the strange, easy friendship they'd built on the foundation of mutual disinterest, neither of them had ever fully explained. "The engagement was never my choice," Matteo continued, his voice steady despite the visible effort it cost him. "It was Father's arrangement before he died, and after he was gone, continuing it felt like honouring his memory, like preserving the one plan he'd made for the family's future that I could actually control. I told myself I could build a life with Serafina, comfortable, companionate, dutiful, and keep Ezra folded quietly into the margins forever. I told myself that was enough." "Matteo," Serafina said softly, "why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't think I had the right to burden you with it," Matteo said. "You were already sacrificing so much, your own dreams, your own future, for this alliance. I thought the least I could do was carry my own sacrifice silently, so you wouldn't have to carry the guilt of mine as well." "That wasn't your burden to carry alone," Serafina said, something fierce entering her voice despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "We could have found another way. Together." "Maybe," Matteo admitted. "But watching the two of you these past months—" He turned his gaze to Antonio, and something passed between the brothers, unspoken and profound. "Watching you fall in love with each other, while trying so desperately not to, for my sake, for the family's sake, it made me realize how much unnecessary pain we were all inflicting on ourselves in the name of an obligation none of us actually wanted." "Matteo," Antonio started, his voice rough. "Let me finish," Matteo said gently. "I've spent 4 years being strategic with my own heart, brother. Watching you almost lose Serafina today, watching the way you held her, like your entire world had almost ended, it reminded me what real love actually looks like. It doesn't look like careful arrangement and dutiful compromise. It looks like terror at the thought of losing someone, and relief so total it breaks a man open. I've never felt that for Serafina. I feel it every single day for Ezra." Serafina wiped at her eyes, overwhelmed by the cascade of revelation, by the sudden, dizzying possibility opening up in front of her after months of believing herself trapped. "What are you saying, Matteo?" "I'm saying," Matteo said, crossing the room to kneel in front of her, taking her hands in his with a tenderness that had nothing to do with romantic love and everything to do with genuine friendship, "that I'm calling off the wedding, tonight, I'm going to tell our father's old associates, tell your father, tell everyone who needs to hear it, that this engagement is over. And I'm going to take whatever consequences come with that decision, because I would rather face my father's ghost with the truth than spend the rest of my life lying to everyone I love, including you. Your father's ghost, Antonio said quietly, would understand better than you think. He loved you, Matteo. Whatever mistakes he made in arranging your future, he never wanted you miserable. I know that much. Matteo looked up at his brother, something grateful and relieved passing across his face. There's more, he said, turning back to Serafina. I know what's between you and Antonio. I've known for months, watched it grow every single day, watched both of you try and fail to bury something that was never meant to be buried. I'm not calling off this wedding just to free myself, Serafina. I'm calling it off because you deserve to marry a man who loves you the way Antonio does, completely, helplessly, without reservation. And Antonio? He turned back to his brother, standing now, his expression open in a way Antonio had rarely witnessed. You deserve to stop punishing yourself for wanting something good in your life. You've spent 8 years sacrificing everything for this family. Let yourself have this. Let yourself have her. Antonio stood slowly, moving to embrace his brother with a fierceness that spoke of decades of complicated, devoted love between them. The kind of bond that survived every family obligation and emerged in this moment stronger and more honest than it had ever been. Thank you, Antonio said, voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, for your courage, for your honesty, for giving us something neither of us had the right to ask for. You didn't have to ask, Matteo said, pulling back to look between his brother and the woman he'd once been engaged to, both of them now openly emotional. The walls between them finally, completely dissolved. I just had to stop being a coward. Serafina stood, crossing to Matteo, embracing him with a warmth that had nothing to do with romantic love and everything to do with genuine gratitude and the particular bond of two people who had survived an impossible situation together. I want to meet him, she said. Ezra, whenever you're ready. I'd like that, Matteo said, smiling for what felt like the first time in months, without any performance behind it. Behind them, Antonio watched the woman he loved embrace his brother with genuine affection. Watched the fractured pieces of their impossible triangle finally resolve into something honest, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the full weight of hope settling in his chest instead of dread. The wedding was cancelled that night. The war with Carlo's remaining allies still loomed, unfinished business requiring careful navigation in the weeks ahead. But for the first time since Serafina De Luca had walked into his father's ballroom 6 months earlier, Antonio Romano allowed himself to believe that he might actually be permitted to keep the one thing he had never dared hope to have. News of the cancelled engagement spread through both families within hours, and the reaction, as Antonio had anticipated, was immediate and volatile. Salvatore De Luca arrived at the penthouse before dawn the next morning, fury radiating off him in waves as he confronted his daughter and both Romano brothers in the same living room where Matteo's confession had unfolded the night before. Do you understand what you've done? Salvatore demanded, pacing the length of the room with barely contained rage. 2 years of negotiation, an alliance that would have secured both our families for a generation, and you're telling me it's over because Matteo Romano prefers the company of men? That's not why the engagement is ending, Salvatore, Antonio said, his voice carrying the flat, absolute authority that had controlled boardrooms and battlefields alike for 8 years. It's ending because it was never a real marriage to begin with. It was a business transaction wearing a wedding dress, and everyone in this room knows it. The alliance doesn't require a marriage, Matteo added, his voice steady, despite his father-in-law that wasn't's obvious fury. It requires trust and mutual benefit, both of which we can build through legitimate business partnership, rather than forcing two people into a lifetime of mutual unhappiness. And what am I supposed to tell people? Salvatore snapped. That my daughter was jilted? That the Romano heir couldn't commit to the arrangement his own father brokered? You tell them the truth, or as much of it as you're comfortable sharing, Serafina said, standing to face her father directly, something steel-edged entering her voice that made even Salvatore pause. You tell them the engagement ended by mutual agreement, because both parties recognized the marriage wasn't serving anyone's genuine interests. You do not tell them about Matteo's personal life, because that is his to share, or not share, as he chooses. And if I hear so much as a whisper of it traced back to you, Father, I will personally ensure every business partner you have learns exactly how many times you've cut corners on territorial agreements over the past decade. Salvatore's face went through several colors before settling on a resigned, wary respect. You've grown teeth, daughter. I've always had them, Serafina said. You just never bothered to notice, because a quiet daughter was more convenient for your negotiations. The silence that followed was thick with years of unspoken tension between father and daughter finally surfacing. And Antonio watched Serafina hold her ground with a fierce pride he made no effort to hide. There's something else, Antonio said, once the immediate tension had settled slightly. Something that concerns the alliance directly, and concerns you as well, Salvatore. He explained, carefully and without embellishment, his intentions towards Serafina, not as a replacement groom stepping into his brother's abandoned role, but as a man who had fallen in love with her, independent of any family arrangement, who intended to court her honestly, on terms she herself would set, without the pressure of contractual obligation hanging over either of them. Salvatore listened with an expression that shifted from renewed fury to grudging consideration. "You want to marry my daughter," he said finally. "Not out of obligation. Out of what? Love?" "Yes," Antonio said simply, without hesitation, without the careful hedging he brought to every other negotiation in his life. "I love your daughter, Salvatore, more than I have ever loved anything or anyone outside my own family. I intend to spend whatever time she'll allow me proving that to her, without contracts, without arranged timelines, without anything except honest courtship. If she says no, I will respect that decision completely, and this family's alliance with yours will still stand on the strength of legitimate business partnership, rather than a forced marriage. But I needed you to hear it from me directly, because you deserve honesty, even if you haven't always offered the same to your own daughter." Salvatore studied his future, or possibly not future, son-in-law for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You're a dangerous man to love, Antonio Romano," he finally said. "But I suppose my daughter has never been drawn to safe things. He left shortly after, still visibly unsettled by the day's revelations, but without any further objection voiced aloud, leaving the three of them alone once more in the aftermath of a confrontation that had, against considerable odds, resolved more peacefully than any of them had feared. "That went better than I expected," Matteo said, exhaling slowly. "He'll come around fully once he sees the alliance holding without the marriage," Antonio said. "Salvatore cares more about power than pride in the end. He'll adjust." Serafina moved to the window, looking out at the city that had witnessed every dangerous, dramatic turn of the past 6 months, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something like genuine hope settling into her chest. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, turning to look at Antonio. He crossed the room to stand beside her, close enough now that neither of them needed to maintain the careful distance that had defined every previous interaction between them. "Now," he said, "if you'll allow it, I would like to take you to dinner. Not as your bodyguard, not as your future brother-in-law, but as a man who has been in love with you for 6 months and would very much like the chance to court you properly." Serafina smiled, the first truly unguarded smile she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember, and reached for his hand. "I would like that very much, Antonio Romano," she said. "Though I should warn you, I don't do anything halfway. If we do this, I intend to fall completely, recklessly in love with you, and I don't intend to hide it from anyone, ever again." "Good," Antonio said, lifting her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles with a tenderness that finally, after 6 agonizing months, carried no restraint behind it. "Because I've been recklessly in love with you since the moment you laughed at that party, and I have no intention of hiding it either, not anymore." Behind them, Matteo watched the culmination of 6 months of careful, painful restraint finally dissolve into something honest and unguarded, and felt, despite everything the day had cost him, a genuine happiness settle over him, the particular joy of watching 2 people he loved finally allowed to love each other freely, without the weight of obligation crushing the possibility between them. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text message to Ezra. "It's done. Dinner tonight? I have a lot to tell you." The reply came within seconds. "I'll cook. Bring wine. I love you." For the first time in 4 years, Matteo didn't have to hide the smile that spread across his face. Antonio Romano had never courted a woman in his life. Every relationship in his adult years had been transactional, brief, careful to avoid any entanglement that might expose vulnerability to enemies watching for exactly that kind of weakness. He had built himself into a fortress, and fortresses, by design, did not open their gates for anyone. But Serafina had already breached every wall he'd constructed, and courting her, he discovered over the following weeks, was less about building something new than about finally allowing the walls to come down entirely. He took her to a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy that had no connection to either family's business, a place where the owner knew him only as Antonio, not Don Romano, where they could sit in a corner booth and talk for hours without the weight of reputation pressing down on every word. "Tell me something no one else knows about you," Serafina said, halfway through a bottle of Chianti, candlelight softening the sharp planes of his face into something achingly human. "I wanted to be an architect," Antonio said, the confession surprising even himself with how easily it came. Before my father died, I used to sketch buildings in the margins of my school notebooks, imagined designing something that would still be standing in 100 years, something that wasn't built on blood and fear. What happened? My father was murdered by a rival family when I was 24, Antonio said, his voice carrying the old grief carefully, the way a man carries a wound long healed but never fully forgotten. Matteo was 18, still in school. Someone had to hold the family together, had to make sure his murder didn't leave us vulnerable to every enemy circling for an opening. I put away the sketches and picked up his responsibilities instead. I never looked back, because looking back meant grieving a future I'd never get to have. Do you regret it? I regretted it every day for years, Antonio admitted. Until recently. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. Now I find myself grateful for the path that led me here, to this table, with you, even though I wouldn't have chosen the cost that got me here. Serafina turned her hand beneath his, lacing their fingers together. Tell me about the buildings you would have designed. He talked for an hour about architecture he'd never built. Libraries with soaring atriums, community centres with gardens on every roof, buildings designed for people rather than power. And Serafina listened with the rapt attention of someone falling more deeply in love with every word, watching a man who had spent 8 years being feared finally allow himself to be known instead. Their courtship continued through the following weeks with a tenderness that surprised everyone who witnessed it. Antonio Romano feared throughout New York's underworld, bringing Serafina flowers with an awkwardness that betrayed how genuinely unpracticed he was at romantic gestures. Taking her to the small bookshop that had once nearly become the site of her abduction, and buying out its entire poetry section as an apology for the trauma the place still carried. Sitting beside her at family dinners with an open affection that made even the most hardened capos smile with genuine warmth. "You're different with her," Vincent observed one evening, watching Antonio laugh at something Serafina had said, an easy, unguarded sound that had been almost entirely absent from his boss's repertoire for the 8 years Vincent had known him. "I'm the same man," Antonio said. "I've just stopped hiding the parts of myself I thought made me weak." "They don't make you weak," Vincent said. "If anything, the men respect you more for it. A boss who can love that openly, that fiercely, is a boss worth following into anything." The remaining threat from Carlo's coalition took another 6 weeks to fully dismantle. Careful negotiations with the smaller families who'd been recruited into his conspiracy, strategic concessions that satisfied their grievances without conceding any real ground, a slow, methodical restoration of peace that Antonio managed with the same precision he brought to every aspect of his empire. But even amid the ongoing business of holding a criminal dynasty together, he made time, every single day, for Serafina. Morning coffee on the terrace, evening walks through the park despite the security risks, quiet nights reading together in the library that had become, over the months, genuinely theirs rather than simply his. "I've been thinking," Serafina said one evening, curled against his side on the library sofa, "about what I actually want. Not what the family needs, not what my father expects. What I want." "Tell me," Antonio said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I want to finish my teaching degree," she said. "I want to work with kids who don't have anyone advocating for them. I want a life that includes this world but isn't entirely consumed by it." She tilted her head up to look at him. "Can you give me that? Or does loving you mean giving up every piece of the ordinary life I've always wanted?" Antonio considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that his answer would shape the entire foundation of whatever future they built together. "I will never ask you to give up your dreams for mine," he said finally. "I spent 8 years believing that love and duty were mutually exclusive, that caring about someone meant eventually watching that care get used as a weapon against you. You've taught me something different, Serafina. You've taught me that the right love doesn't diminish either person. It makes both of you larger. Finish your degree. Teach your students. Build the ordinary parts of your life you've always wanted, and I will build my world around protecting the space for you to do it, rather than asking you to fold yourself into mine." Serafina's eyes filled with tears, the particular emotion of being truly seen and truly honoured settling over her like something warm and permanent. "I love you," she said, the words easy now, unguarded, nothing like the careful, terrified confession they'd once been. "I love you, Antonio Romano, completely and recklessly, exactly as I promised." "I love you," he said back, the words still new enough to feel like a small miracle every time he spoke them. "More than I have ever loved anything, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it." Outside, the city moved through its endless rhythm of danger and ambition, indifferent to the quiet miracle unfolding in a penthouse library. Two people who had spent months believing their love was a betrayal, finally allowed to simply love each other, without guilt, without restraint, without the shadow of obligation darkening what had become, against every early fear, the truest and most honest relationship either of them had ever known. Serafina met Ezra Castellano on a rainy Tuesday evening in November, at the same Brooklyn apartment where Matteo had spent 4 years hiding the truest part of himself. She arrived with Antonio, both of them carrying wine, and the particular nervousness of meeting someone who mattered enormously to a person they loved. Ezra opened the door with an easy warmth that immediately put Serafina at ease. Tall, unassuming, with kind eyes and the calloused fingers of someone who played instruments for a living, rather than commanded violence for one. The apartment behind him was small, but lived in, warm in a way the Romano penthouse, for all its luxury, had never quite managed to be. Records stacked against one wall, a well-worn piano in the corner, photographs of Matteo and Ezra together, spanning years, hidden now from public view, but clearly, evidently, a real and substantial life. "So you're the famous Serafina," Ezra said, taking her coat with genuine friendliness. "Matteo's told me so much about you. I feel like I already know you." "And you're the man who's had my former fiancé's heart for 4 years," Serafina said, smiling. "I have to say, I approve. He seems considerably happier since he stopped hiding you." "We're both happier," Ezra admitted, glancing toward Matteo with an open affection that made Serafina's chest ache with something like vicarious joy. 4 years of secrecy takes a toll, even when the person's worth it. They spent the evening around Ezra's small kitchen table, eating a meal Ezra had cooked himself, the conversation flowing easily in a way none of them had quite anticipated. Matteo, freed from months of careful compartmentalization, seemed almost like a different person, lighter, quicker to laugh, touching Ezra's hand across the table with a casual intimacy that spoke of genuine, unguarded love. "Can I ask," Serafina said carefully, midway through dinner, "what happens now? With the family, I mean. Does your father's associates know? Does anyone outside this room? Matteo's expression sobered slightly. Not yet. Antonio knows. You know now. But the wider family, the Capos, the extended relatives, my father's old friends, that's a harder conversation. Our world isn't exactly progressive about this kind of thing. Are you planning to tell them? Eventually, Matteo said. I'm not ashamed of Ezra, and I refuse to spend the rest of my life hiding him the way I hid him for the sake of an engagement I never wanted. But there's a difference between refusing shame and being reckless about safety. Some of the old guard would use this against the family if given the opportunity. I need to handle the timing carefully with Antonio's help, to make sure Ezra's safety and mine aren't compromised in the process. I can help with that, Antonio said, his voice carrying the particular authority that had, over the past months, come to feel less like intimidation and more like genuine protection. I've already started laying groundwork, identifying which capos would need to be brought in carefully, which ones might pose a risk, how to frame the announcement in a way that emphasizes loyalty and family strength rather than vulnerability. It'll take time, but it's manageable. You'd do that? Ezra asked, looking between the brothers with something like disbelief. Risk the family's stability for this? My brother spent 4 years hiding the person he loves to protect a family that should have protected his happiness instead, Antonio said simply. I intend to make sure that sacrifice ends now, permanently, regardless of what it costs to manage the transition. You're not a liability, Ezra. You're the reason my brother finally looks like himself again, after years of performing a life that wasn't his. That's worth protecting. Ezra's eyes filled with tears. He quickly blinked away, and Matteo reached for his hand beneath the table, squeezing gently. Thank you, Ezra said quietly, for seeing it that way. Most people in your position wouldn't. Most people in my position, Antonio said, haven't spent the last 6 months learning that love, real love, is worth every risk it demands. I would have said the same thing you're worried about 6 months ago, that love was a weakness this family couldn't afford. Serafina taught me otherwise. I intend to make sure Matteo gets the same chance to be happy that she's given me. The evening stretched late into the night. 4 people who had each in their own way been forced to hide essential parts of themselves for the sake of a world that valued power over honesty, finally allowed to simply exist together without pretense. By the time Serafina and Antonio left, well past midnight, the rain had cleared into a crisp, star-scattered sky, and Serafina found herself crying softly in the car, overwhelmed by the day's accumulated emotion. Are you all right? Antonio asked, concerned, reaching for her hand. I'm more than all right, Serafina said, wiping at her eyes with a small, watery laugh. 6 months ago, I thought I was trapped in a life with no possibility of real happiness. I thought love was something other people got to have, and I would spend my life performing contentment instead of actually feeling it. Tonight, watching Matteo and Ezra together, watching how hard you're willing to fight to protect their happiness, I finally understand what real family looks like. Not blood obligation, not strategic alliance. This. People choosing to protect each other's happiness, even when it's difficult, even when it costs something. Antonio lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles as the car wound its way back toward Manhattan. That's the family I want to build with you, he said quietly. Not the one my father built, based on fear and obligation. the one we're building now, based on choice. I want our home to be a place where people are free to be exactly who they are, without fear of what it costs them. I want that too, Serafina whispered, resting her head against his shoulder as the city lights blurred past the window. I want that more than I've ever wanted anything. They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, two people who had each spent months believing themselves trapped by circumstance, finally allowing themselves to imagine a future built on nothing more complicated or dangerous than genuine, chosen love. 6 months after Antonio Romano first watched Serafina De Luca laugh across a crowded ballroom, he stood in that same ballroom once more, this time with a very different purpose in mind. The gathering was smaller than the original engagement party had been. Close family, trusted capos, the De Luca inner circle. Vincent standing at Antonio's side with the particular pride of a man who had watched his boss transform over the past 6 months into someone almost unrecognizable from the controlled, isolated figure he'd once served. Matteo stood near the back with Ezra beside him, introduced tonight for the first time to the wider family as exactly what he was, not a friend, not a business associate, but the man Matteo Romano loved and intended to build a life with, consequences be damned. The reaction, as Antonio had carefully orchestrated over weeks of quiet groundwork, had been mixed but manageable. A few older capos exchanging uncertain glances, quickly silenced by Antonio's evident, unwavering support of his brother's choice. Most of the family simply relieved to see Matteo genuinely happy for the first time in years. Salvatore De Luca, invited despite the awkward history, had offered Matteo a stiff but genuine handshake, his old-world instincts warring visibly with a grudging respect for the younger man's courage. Now, as the evening reached its natural close, Antonio raised a glass, calling the room's attention with the effortless authority that had commanded respect for 8 years. 6 months ago, Antonio began, I stood in this room and watched my brother become engaged to a woman I had no right to want. I told myself that night that whatever I felt was nothing, a passing curiosity, easily buried beneath duty and obligation. I was wrong about a great many things that night, but I was most wrong about that. Serafina, standing beside him in a deep emerald gown that made her look, Antonio thought, like something conjured from every architectural dream he'd ever abandoned, reached for his free hand, lacing their fingers together in front of the entire assembled family. Serafina De Luca taught me that love isn't a weakness this family can't afford, Antonio continued, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room. It's the only thing worth building an empire to protect. She taught me that the walls I built to keep myself safe were also keeping me alone, and that the bravest thing a man in my position can do isn't holding power through fear. It's choosing to be vulnerable with the people who deserve his trust. He turned to face her fully, releasing her hand only to reach into his jacket pocket, producing a small velvet box that made the room collectively inhale, a hush falling over the gathered crowd. Serafina, Antonio said, dropping to one knee, with a vulnerability the room had never witnessed from him before. You came into my life as my brother's fiancée, and I spent months believing that loving you would destroy everything I'd built to protect this family. I was wrong. Loving you hasn't destroyed anything. It's made me a better man, a better brother, a better leader than I ever was when I believed strength meant isolation. I don't want to build an empire without you beside me. I want to build a life, an ordinary, extraordinary life, filled with the things you've always wanted and the things I never knew I wanted until you taught me to want them. Will you marry me? Not because our families need an alliance, not because duty demands it, simply because I love you, completely and without reservation, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. Serafina's eyes filled with tears, her hand trembling as she reached for the ring he offered, the entire room holding its breath around them. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Antonio, 1,000 times yes." The room erupted into applause as Antonio slid the ring onto her finger and rose to pull her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness and passion that finally, completely erased every careful boundary they'd once maintained between them. Matteo, watching from the back of the room, with Ezra's hand clasped in his own, felt tears gather in his own eyes. Relief and joy tangled together into something almost overwhelming. "You did good, brother," Matteo said quietly, once the crowd's attention had shifted to congratulating the newly engaged couple. Vincent already organizing an impromptu toast. "Better than good." "We both did," Antonio said, glancing toward Ezra with genuine warmth. "Took us both long enough to stop being cowards about what we actually wanted." "Better late than never," Matteo said, smiling. "Though I have to say, watching you propose with that much genuine emotion was almost enough to make me forget you're the most feared man in New York's underworld." "Don't get used to it," Antonio said, though his own smile betrayed the truth, that whatever fearsome reputation he maintained for the sake of business, the man standing in this room tonight, engaged to the woman he loved, surrounded by family, finally free to be honest with each other, bore little resemblance to the isolated, controlled figure who had first watched Serafina De Luca laugh across a crowded ballroom 6 months earlier. Salvatore De Luca approached as the celebration continued around them, offering Antonio a considering look before extending his hand. "You've made my daughter happier than I've seen her in years," he said gruffly. "I suppose that's worth more than any alliance contract I could have drafted." "It is," Antonio agreed, shaking his hand firmly. "I intend to keep making her that happy for the rest of our lives." "See that you do," Salvatore said, though something almost like warmth had crept into his usually guarded expression. "Or you'll answer to me, Romano name or not." Antonio laughed, a real, unguarded sound that surprised everyone within earshot, and pulled Serafina back into his arms as the celebration continued around them, both of them, finally, completely free to claim the love that had once seemed impossible, dangerous, forbidden by every rule their world had taught them to obey. Peace in the world Antonio Romano ruled was never permanent. But 3 months after the engagement, as spring finally softened the hard edges of a New York winter, the fragile stability they'd built held firm enough for Antonio to allow himself, for the first time in years, the luxury of planning a future rather than simply surviving each day's threats. The remaining fractures from Carlo's conspiracy had been fully resolved. The smaller families who joined his coalition brought back into careful alignment through a combination of concessions and quiet reminders of Romano power. The underworld's collective memory of the incident settling into the particular silence that accompanied matters best left undiscussed. Salvatore De Luca had proven, against Antonio's early skepticism, to be a genuinely useful ally, once his pride had recovered from the collapse of his original marriage plans, the legitimate business partnership between the two families expanding into territories neither patriarch could have secured alone. "The Battaglia family wants a meeting," Vincent reported one morning, finding Antonio in his study, reviewing wedding venue proposals with an attention to detail that would have seemed absurd to anyone who'd known him a year earlier. "They're interested in discussing a formal territory-sharing agreement for the waterfront districts." "Schedule it," Antonio said, not looking up from a floor plan for a garden venue in Westchester that Serafina had circled twice. "Next week, if their schedule allows." "You seem distracted, boss," Vincent said, a note of genuine amusement in his voice. "I'm choosing between two nearly identical garden layouts for a wedding 6 months from now," Antonio said dryly. "Forgive me if territorial negotiations feel slightly less urgent by comparison." Vincent laughed, a sound that had become increasingly common in the Romano organization over the past year, the entire operation gradually shifting under Antonio's leadership from an atmosphere of fear-driven efficiency to something that, while still ruthlessly protective of its interests, carried a warmth previously absent from every level of the hierarchy. Serafina, for her part, had thrown herself into finishing her teaching degree with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, spending her days at Fordham and her evenings helping Antonio navigate the particular chaos of wedding planning alongside the ongoing business of running a criminal empire. She had also, in the months since their engagement, begun quietly establishing a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, using Romano resources for something entirely removed from the family's usual business, a project Antonio supported without hesitation, understanding it as exactly the kind of ordinary, meaningful life she'd always wanted, built now within rather than despite the world she'd been born into. "I want to name it after your father," she told Antonio one evening, showing him the finalized paperwork for the scholarship's legal structure. "The Giovanni Romano Foundation for Educational Opportunity. He gave up his own dreams to protect this family. I think he'd want to see something built from that sacrifice that helps people escape the very world that demanded it." Antonio studied the paperwork for a long moment, something moving behind his careful composure that Serafina had learned over the past year to recognize as genuine emotion he rarely allowed himself to display. "He would have loved you," he said finally, voice rough. "My father valued strength, but he valued kindness more, even though this world rarely gave him room to show it. You would have understood him better than most people ever did. I wish I could have known him." "You know pieces of him," Antonio said, reaching for her hand. "Every good thing about Matteo, about me, it comes from him, buried under years of necessary hardness. You're helping both of us remember the parts of ourselves he actually wanted us to become." Matteo, meanwhile, had spent the months since his public relationship with Ezra navigating the complicated waters of family reaction with a courage that had earned him considerably more respect than he'd anticipated. A handful of older capos had quietly distanced themselves, unable to reconcile old-world prejudice with new reality. But the majority of the organization, taking their cue from Antonio's unwavering support, had simply absorbed the change and moved forward, more focused on business stability than on judging their boss's brother's personal life. Ezra had begun, tentatively, integrating into family gatherings. Sunday dinners at the penthouse, holiday celebrations, the particular rhythm of a family learning to expand its definition of belonging to include love that didn't fit its traditional mold. Matteo, watching Ezra laugh easily with Serafina over some shared joke about Antonio's newfound domesticity, felt a contentment he had once believed entirely incompatible with his birthright. 4 years of hiding, Ezra said one evening, watching Antonio attempt, with visible concentration, to properly fold napkins for an upcoming dinner party under Serafina's amused direction. I never imagined it would end with your terrifying older brother folding napkins. Neither did I, Matteo admitted, laughing. Love makes fools of all of us, apparently, even the most feared man in New York's underworld. Especially him, Ezra said, watching Antonio glance up to catch Serafina's eye across the room, the two of them sharing a private smile that spoke of an intimacy built on genuine partnership rather than obligation. I don't think I've ever seen someone transform so completely. As spring deepened into early summer, the wedding date finally set for late June. The small, complicated family that Antonio, Serafina, Matteo and Ezra had built together continued to grow into something none of them could have imagined a year earlier. A family defined not by the fear and obligation that had once governed every relationship within it, but by the deliberate, difficult, ultimately rewarding choice to love each other honestly, regardless of what the wider world demanded of them. The old threats hadn't disappeared entirely. Power in their world never came without cost, and Antonio remained as vigilant as ever against the enemies who circled New York's underworld, looking for weakness to exploit. But for the first time in 8 years of leadership, he faced those threats not as an isolated fortress, but as a man surrounded by people who loved him, fought for him, and gave him something worth protecting beyond mere territory and reputation. He had built an empire on fear. He was learning, finally, to build a life on love. The wedding took place on a warm June evening at the same Westchester garden venue Serafina had circled twice on that floor plan months earlier. String lights woven through ancient oak trees, the air thick with the scent of blooming roses, and the particular electricity of a celebration that had been, in every sense, earned rather than arranged. Serafina stood in the small bridal suite, her mother's veil, carefully preserved, brought out for the first time since her mother's death, cascading down her back, and studied her reflection with a sense of wonder that still occasionally caught her off guard. A year ago, she had stood in a different room, preparing for a different wedding, feeling nothing but resigned duty at the prospect of the vows she was about to make. Today, every part of her hummed with an anticipation so joyful it felt almost unfamiliar, a happiness she had once believed reserved for people whose lives hadn't been shaped by Mafia obligation and arranged futures. "You look beautiful," her father said, appearing in the doorway, his usual gruffness softened by visible emotion. "Your mother would have been proud. Not just of how you look today, but of the woman you've become, strong enough to fight for what you actually wanted, instead of settling for what was arranged." "Thank you, Papa," Serafina said, embracing him carefully to avoid disturbing her dress. "For understanding, eventually, that I needed to find my own path to happiness." "I understood it faster than you probably give me credit for," Salvatore said, offering a rare, genuine smile. "I just needed a little time to accept that the path led somewhere I hadn't originally planned." Outside, the ceremony space had filled with a guest list that spoke to how completely their small, complicated family had grown over the past year. Romano Capos standing alongside DeLuca associates, old rivalries set aside for an evening in favour of genuine celebration. Ezra seated in the front row beside Matteo, both of them dressed with matching elegance, no longer hiding the depth of their relationship from anyone in attendance. Vincent, serving as Antonio's best man with visible pride, having watched his boss's transformation over the past year with the particular satisfaction of someone who had feared for a long time that Antonio might never allow himself genuine happiness. Antonio stood at the altar as the ceremony began, watching Serafina walk toward him on her father's arm, and felt every carefully constructed wall he had once built around his heart finally, completely dissolve. She moved through the garden with the same unguarded joy she'd shown at their very first meeting, the laugh that had first betrayed his careful composure, now fully unleashed, aimed entirely at him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Matteo whispered from his position beside his brother, serving as groomsman despite the strange history that had once made such a role seem impossible. "I feel like I'm seeing a miracle," Antonio murmured back, unable to look away from Serafina as she approached. When she finally reached him, taking his hands as the officiant began the ceremony, Antonio found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely present. Not calculating threats, not managing contingencies, not holding himself apart from vulnerability for the sake of survival. Simply here, in this moment, with the woman who had taught him that love wasn't the weakness he'd once believed it to be, but the truest strength he'd ever known. "Antonia," the officiant said, "do you take Serafina to be your wife, to love and protect in this world and whatever storms it brings, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Antonio said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet garden, absolute and unwavering. "I have protected this family with fear for 8 years. I intend to protect this marriage with love for the rest of my life." "Serafina," the officiant continued, "do you take Antonio to be your husband, to love and support, choosing him freely and completely for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Serafina said, tears of joy sliding freely down her cheeks. "I spent months believing love was a luxury I couldn't afford in this world. Antonio taught me it's the only thing worth building a life around. I choose him, freely and completely, today and every day after." The kiss that followed was met with thunderous applause. The assembled guests, capos and civilians, old enemies and new friends, a family built through equal parts blood and choice, rising to celebrate a union that had, against every early obstacle, finally arrived at its rightful conclusion. Later, as the reception unfolded beneath the string lights, Antonio found a quiet moment alone with Matteo near the edge of the garden, both brothers watching Serafina laugh with Ezra across the dance floor, the particular joy of family finally, completely at peace with itself. "Thank you," Antonio said quietly, "for your courage that night, for giving both of us the chance to be honest about what we actually wanted, instead of what duty demanded." "You'd have found your way here eventually," Matteo said. "You two were always going to end up together. I just saved everyone a lot of unnecessary suffering by admitting the truth sooner rather than later." "Still," Antonio said, "thank you for everything." Matteo smiled, glancing toward Ezra, who caught his eye across the garden and smiled back with an open, unguarded love that no longer needed to hide in the margins of a careful, compartmentalized life. "We both got exactly what we needed, brother. Sometimes the hardest truths turn out to be the greatest gifts once you're brave enough to speak them." As the evening deepened into night, the garden glowing beneath its canopy of string lights, Antonio pulled his wife into his arms for their first dance as husband and wife, and felt, with a certainty that had once seemed impossible for a man who'd spent his life ruling through fear, that he had, finally, completely, found his way home. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, holding her close as they swayed together beneath the stars, "more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anything." "I love you too," Serafina whispered back, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady, certain rhythm of his heart. "Completely and recklessly, exactly as I promised, for the rest of our lives." Around them, their carefully rebuilt family continued its celebration. Two brothers who had each in their own way found the courage to choose love over duty. Two people who had once been forbidden to want each other, now bound together forever. And a future finally free of the shadows that had once threatened to keep them apart. The empire Antonio Romano ruled remained as dangerous and demanding as ever, the underworld's currents of ambition and betrayal never fully at rest. But standing in that garden, his wife in his arms, his brother finally free to love openly, Antonio understood that he had built something far more valuable than territory or reputation. He had built a family worth protecting, not through fear, but through love, chosen freely and held fiercely for the rest of his life.